all is one brings us back to Phyrexia and back to Poison. We've got new ways to put poison counters on opponents, new ways to proliferate, and most importantly, to the interests of this channel, new poison-based commander decks. Join me in a deep dive on poison decks featuring some of the new poison-based commanders. Now, I'm primarily going to focus on these new legendaries. I left out a few of the monocolored ones, but you can assume a lot of them show up in these decks. But they all kind of point us in slightly different directions, which I think really opens up the styles of deck to play with using poison strategies. Now, arguably the first point of poison is the most important, because after that point we can proliferate. We've now got more spell-based ways to get some poison counters on opponents. Unlike creatures, the only opportunity to interact with these is with counter magic. We've got a handful of spells in green, black, and blue that put a poison counter on each opponent, and they're all cheap enough and probably worth running anyway. Reaching back, we've got Ichor Rats. This also puts a poison counter on us when it enters the battlefield, but technically it also puts it on each opponent. Unless the meta gets flooded with poison decks, I don't think giving yourself one poison should be too much of a liability, but there might be another proliferate deck out there. Going back to new Phyrexia, we have Caress of Phyrexia. It's very expensive, it's 5 mana, but a target player gets to draw 3 cards, lose 3 life, and get 3 poison counters. I don't love this to put the first poison counters on someone, but as a finisher, it's fine. And the true bottom of the barrel is Decimator Web, too expensive. Dimir one has the best access to spell-based poison and a phenomenal proliferating package. I do think you could brew a deck like this without many infect or toxic creatures at all. I'll dig a little deeper on that later though. Any other proliferate and poison deck is gonna want some boots on the ground to do the dirty work, and that's creatures. It's time to talk about toxic versus infect. They do work a little bit differently, but I think the simplest solution is to just look at infect creatures with 1 power and creatures with toxic 1. Which happen to mostly have 1 power anyway. So this way, no matter what's hitting a player, they're getting 1 poison counter from it. And we've got quite a few. Just by spending a single mana, white has 2 creatures, both of them with toxic 1. One of them being a legendary that I'm not going to put a whole deck together around. Surprisingly, black only gets 1 at 1 mana, toxic 1, but it's a 1/1 with death touch, which is nice. Green has 2, a 1/1 infect, and a 1/2 toxic 1. Then we've got Vector Aspen colorless, which technically doesn't have infect, we just have to pay black to give it infect. And if we look at 2 mana creatures, there's 10, a white one, a blue one, 3 black ones, 2 green ones, and 3 colorless cards. Also, Venser himself, if you count the Dimir commander. I think another very useful reason to look at low-powered creatures. We get to take advantage of behind the scenes. There's a white activated ability, so the identity of this enchantment is Orzhov. And if you don't remember what Skulk has, this gives all your creatures Skulk, which means they can't be blocked by creatures with greater power. Other 1/1 tokens will stop them, but anything bigger than that and your army is unblockable. And since everyone deals out 1 poison counter, that's just 10 creatures getting through. I can't completely ignore things with 2 power though. There's just some really good ones. Blight Belly Rat is a way to get a poison counter in if it goes through unblocked, but also proliferates when it dies. In the Dimir deck, the Voidwing Hybrid should be excellent. As I said, blue can proliferate pretty easily, so being able to return this back to your hand is very nice. The Viridian Corruptor is one of the more expensive infect creatures in the deck at 3 mana, but it destroys an artifact. Gotta run stuff like this. And there's some pretty good equipment too. Prosthetic Injector is nice in that it doesn't give the creature more power, which sounds weird, but we still get through with that Skulk ability. And now we've got an extra instance of Toxic 1. It stacks. Toxic 1, that's 2 poison counters. Now the Infested Flesh Cutter doesn't actually give the creature any additional ways to do poison. It's better on Infect because it boosts the power, but you're making extra creatures that are toxic 1, the mites. Then there's good old Grafted Exoskeleton. It gives something infect and +2/+2. Speaking of mites, let's take a moment and look a little bit closer in the white-black poison deck. Ria Ivor, Bane of Bladehold. I haven't really thought about a black-white poison deck before. Ria Ivor doesn't have any infect or toxic themselves, but we have an ability where we get to pick a creature at the beginning of combat, and if it would deal combat damage, we can prevent it and instead make that many mites. Mites are little 1/1s with toxic 1. It's super telegraphed, because we have to pick it before we send in attackers and our opponents will just know what to remove. So it may not be super reliable to get extra mites from Ria Ivor, but the other strength of having white is we have access to things like Skrelv's Hive. Every upkeep you lose a life and make a little mite. We've got White Sun's Twilight. This is a white X sorcery, gain X life, and create X little mites. And if X happens to be 5 or more, we get to destroy all other creatures. We might not want that one, or maybe we do. Because another one of the strengths of a black and white deck is bringing stuff back from the graveyard to play. We won't have a problem sending a bunch of our team to the graveyard. We can swing the whole team at a player, maybe they block a few, they go to the graveyard, that's fine. If we can get 4 or 5 poison on them from the swing, I'll take it because we get to run things like Idol of Endurance. Another advantage of going with cheap creatures. They have low power, but that means the idol hits all of them. The only reason this is playable is because it actually returns the cards to the graveyard if the idol leaves the battlefield. We've also got Dusk to Dawn. The destroy side hits all the creatures we care about and should avoid most of ours. And specifically, I've chosen creatures with low power so we get the whole team back from the graveyard. The whole team's eligible from Return to the Ranks also, and if we already have something on the battlefield to convoke them, we should be able to get every creature out of the graveyard. The ones with Toxic or Infect anyway. And you're probably already ahead of me, but we definitely also want Lurrus of the Dream Den in a deck like this. We get to cast something cheap from our graveyard every turn. Between that, the Idol of Endurance, in a black and white deck, looking at all the creatures that have either Toxic or Infect that cost 1 or 2 mana, Lurrus can bring back 16 of them. That's pretty good. And if we are white-black, we also have a bit of a flicker package possible. Glimmerpoint Stag flickers any permanent, comes back at the beginning of the next end step. Flicker Wisps, same deal. And these work great with something like Glistening Sphere. That's an extra Proliferate. And if we don't have that first counter, let's blink an Icarats. And I almost forgot about Mirror of Life Trapping. It's a little 4-mana artifact. Came out in Baldur's Gate. It just kind of double triggers creatures with ETB abilities. It doesn't work on the Glistening Sphere, but Icarats now puts 2 poison counters on everybody. It definitely seems viable to me. So let's take a step back and look at just general Proliferate. There's tons of creatures that have the text, when this deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. There's a couple in blue, and they're evasive flyers, which is very nice. White also has an evasive flyer. Green has a couple of options. Bloated Contaminator has Toxic 1 and is a 4/4 with Trample. The Trample's nice because you can't chump it, and we will probably manage to proliferate and put a poison counter on as well. Park Heights Maverick, a card I forgot existed from the new Capenna Commander decks. This 2/2 can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Doesn't have Infect or Toxic, but when this deals combat damage to a player or when it dies, you proliferate. 2 proliferates on 1 card isn't bad. And if you got $25 to drop, Sword of Truth and Justice. Specifically, Containment Grafter is nice. It's a 5/5 with Trample and Toxic 1, which is nice. Costs 5, that's less nice. But this is an interesting line of text. Whenever 1 or more creatures you control deals combat damage to 1 or more players, proliferate. So it kind of grants the proliferate combat ability to your whole team. And this is the first card with Corrupted, which is not something I really want to brew around specifically. I still think you're going to want to finish off players 1 at a time, but this Corrupted is just bonus, and it's good bonus too. If we do want to proliferate a lot, the single best way to proliferate a lot of times in 1 turn has to be Evolution Sage. It's not tied to combat, it's not tied to creatures entering or leaving, it's just landfall. And we're in green. Any land that sacrifices to find another land is 2 landfall triggers. And not only does green have great landfall proliferate abilities, we've also got access to all of green's regrowth options. So if we start looking more specifically at the Obzon commanders, we gotta consider Nethroi Apex of Death. This is another reason why I think it's useful to look at low power creatures with Toxic or Infect. We get to pick total power 10 to bring back into play. That's 10 creatures with Infect or Toxic. You know what I mean. Now, we will want to have haste in this case though. That's a fun surprise if we can attack right away. And Concordant Crossroads did get a little bit cheaper from some reprints recently. It's still $12 to $15 though. Now, if that's too much, maybe you run something like a Crashing Drawbridge. It's got 0 power, so Nethroi can bring it back at no extra charge on that 10 power limit. We need to give this thing haste somehow, but there's tons of equipment that does that. Maybe a Lightning Greaves, I don't know. And so if we're doing an Obzon thing, which of these Obzon Toxic Poison based commanders should we pick? For my money, neither. I think we go Sidar Kondo of Jamura. This is the Selesnya partner that says creatures your opponents control without flying or reach can't block creatures with power 2 or less. Again, that's the whole team that we care about. The Toxics, the Infects. They become mostly unblockable. We just gotta partner this up with something black. Maybe Armix, Filigree Thrasher, or maybe Tormod the Desecrator is a better option for partner. We are talking about a lot of stuff coming out of the graveyard, so all those extra zombies can't be bad. And if we're doing obs on, we still get to absorb the enter the battlefield ability with some flicker, and we have a lot more options with green. Contagious Vorak is very nice. It's either proliferate or helps us find a land. Bloom Hulk is a proliferate on entry. Huatli's Raptor is a cheap proliferate on entry. I'd happily flicker any of these. And so here's a fun twist on an obs on poison strategy that I've never run before. Enchantress, specifically inspired by Venerated Rot Priest. This is one of the 1 mana, 1/2 toxic 1 creatures. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. If we can run a few Enchantress cards so that we benefit from targeting our own creatures with auras and such, then we get access to Flickering Ward, we can pay a white to put it back in our hand and keep putting it back down on the Rot Priest or something else. More poison counters. Conviction is the same thing, just costs a little bit more. And we even have a ton of auras that we're happy to target our own things with. Things that when they die, they come back to our hand. Rancor is a classic for this. Not to mention the trample, the +2/+0, that's what we want when we would just want to do some combat damage. Sleeper's Guile is a deep cut. It's from Urza's Legacy. 3 mana enchant creature, aura. Enchanted creature has fear. It can't be blocked except by artifact and or black creatures. It's a nice bit of evasion on a creature we definitely want to do combat damage. And if it's put into a graveyard from play, return Sleeper's Guile to its owner's hand. That means more Enchantress triggers, which is either more card draw or whatever else we got going on. I probably want to make room for Tethmost High Priest. This is a 3 mana 2/3 in white with Heroic. Whenever we cast a spell targeting Tethmost High Priest, we get to return a creature with converted mana cost 2 or less from the graveyard right into play. Again, that's the majority of the team, overlaps with Lurrus. Speaking of Lurrus, we can beef up that package too with stuff like Kaya's Ghost Form, a classic way to protect Lurrus itself. We get Necrogen Communion now. It gives the creature Toxic 2, which is pretty nice. Necrogen Communion doesn't come back from the graveyard to our hand, but the creature does. Hopefully with a few Enchantresses out there, we've gotten our value. And last but not least, I do want to spend a moment to talk about the blue-black Spellslinger version of this. This might be the most unique poison deck out of the bunch. It's not all about creatures and reanimating and combat damage, and I think that's good because blue doesn't have the same depth of creatures. We still have all the colorless ones and all the black ones, but blue mostly gives us Blighted Agent, which is excellent, 1/1 unblockable with Infect, and as I mentioned before, the evasive when this deals combat damage Proliferate. We do get a lot of spells that give poison. Prologue to Phyresis is one of my favorites because it's a 2 mana instant that draws us a card, but each opponent gets a poison count. This deck will definitely want everyone to be poisoned and proliferate for the win. Flux Channeler is an MVP. We've also got Inexorable Tide, which is the enchantment version of that. Whenever you cast a spell, proliferate. And this also triggers when we cast our creatures, so that's nice. And maybe in this brew, we have a lot of ways to return spells from the graveyard to our hand. Let's return those spells that add poison counters. Keep returning them, keep adding poison. Or maybe we just put more counter spells back into our hand. We've got access to Archaeomancer, which is something with an ETB to return an instant and sorcery to our hand. And we do have blink spells like Essence Flux to get extra triggers. And we can even double dip with cards like Demi-Lich. We can exile a key spell that puts poison counters down, copy it from our graveyard. Spell Twine can recast a poison spell from our graveyard as well as something cool from an opponent's deck. I mean, if you've got $10 to spare, you definitely want to run Tecuthal Inquiry Dominus. This is the new Phyrexian horror. Man, creatures have gotten pumped up recently. This is a 4 mana 3/5 with flying. And if you would proliferate twice instead. Oof. So now all we gotta do is cast one of those spells to put a poison counter on everybody. And with Flux Channeler, every time we cast a single instant, we're putting 2 more poison counters because of double proliferate. And I do want to point out Throne of Geth. It's a repeatable way to proliferate. We just have to sacrifice an artifact. And specifically, Venser, our commander in this deck, makes an artifact creature whenever we proliferate. If we can put in ways to untap the throne, as long as we keep sacking this legendary artifact to activate the throne, we'll keep making more of these Sentinel things. Another great way to close out the game. Now that we've been back to Phyrexia again, I think we've got a lot of good new options, and these decks feel a little bit different than a lot of the other Infect decks I've seen. I mean, we can't really call them Infect decks because we're doing a lot of Toxic as well. What do you think of decks like this? Do you think these feel different enough that you won't get just a ton of heat from the table just by bringing in a deck that has the capability of doing poison? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you. I'm trying to put an episode out about once a week, and if you like these and you want to see more, you can find out how to support the show in the show notes. And thanks for watching. You keep being you. The world's a better place for it. See you next time.